They called him Invisible, the widower who carried bundles of firewood down the dusty path every morning as if trying to warm a life gone cold. But that morning, something stopped him in his tracks. There, by the roadside, lay a man, unconscious, with a baby asleep in his arms. The wind paused, the birds quieted, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to ask him one question: will you walk away too? Samuel could have. He had learned to live unseen, untouched, unneeded. But instead, he set down the firewood that had carried his loneliness and chose mercy. What began as a small act of kindness would soon test every belief he held about grief, faith, and what it means to belong. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't begin with strength. They begin with surrender. And that day, by the dusty road, one man's compassion would light a fire that would change an entire village forever. If Samuel's story already stirs something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes that kindness can still change lives. Your support helps us bring more real, emotional stories like this one to the world. Now let's step into Samuel's world, where one simple act became a quiet miracle. They called him Invisible. Samuel, the widower who carried firewood before dawn, his silhouette moving against the pale light like a ghost that never stopped working. Every morning he walked the same dusty path, his back bent under the weight of wood and memory. The village barely noticed him anymore. They greeted him out of habit, not kindness. He didn't expect warmth. He hadn't for years, not since the fever took his wife, Lena, one cruel night when prayers were too late and medicine too far. She'd been his laughter, his music, his reason to rise with the sun. When she left, so did the sound of his voice. Samuel's days blurred into each other. Gather wood, sell what he could, eat little, sleep less. The silence of his clay house was both comfort and punishment. The world outside had its noise, markets, gossip, laughter, but inside there was only the sound of wind against walls and the faint crackle of an old fire that never truly warmed him. That morning, though, something changed. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in thin strokes of orange and gold, when Samuel saw it, a shape lying motionless by the roadside. From a distance, it looked like a discarded bundle. He almost ignored it. Life on that road was full of things people left behind, sacks, shoes, broken hopes. But something, a glint of fabric maybe, or a feeling, made him stop. He stepped closer. What he saw stopped the breath in his chest. A man lay there, face down in the dust, one arm curved protectively around a small child, a baby, maybe a year old at most, sleeping as if the chaos of the world could not touch him. Samuel dropped the firewood. It hit the ground with a hollow thud, scattering dust into the morning air. He knelt down beside them. The man's skin was fever-hot, his pulse faint but there. The baby shifted slightly, a quiet whimper escaping his lips before settling again against the man's chest. Samuel's heart pounded. He had seen sickness before, death before, too many times. But this was different. There was life here, fragile and clinging. He hesitated. He was old, tired, unseen. What could he do? Yet, as he looked at the man's hand clutching the child's blanket even in unconsciousness, something inside him refused to turn away. He whispered softly, almost as if to the morning itself, "Not today." With effort that strained his aging muscles, Samuel lifted the baby first, pressing the small body against his chest. The child stirred but didn't cry. Then he hoisted the man, awkwardly, carefully, and began the slow walk back toward his house. The firewood lay forgotten on the road behind him. By the time he reached home, sweat had soaked through his shirt, his back ached, and his breath came in rough waves. He laid the man on the straw mat that once belonged to Lena. the only piece of her he hadn't brought himself to throw away. The baby he placed in a woven basket lined with one of her old scarves. He fetched water from the well, boiled it, and began to clean the stranger's face. The man's skin was darkened by the sun, his clothes torn, his feet blistered. A necklace of blue beads rested around his neck, worn, yet clearly treasured. Samuel touched it lightly before wiping away the dust. "You've walked far," he murmured. He didn't expect an answer. He didn't even expect the man to live through the night. But there was a kind of peace in the act of caring. A rhythm his hands seemed to remember even when his heart had forgotten how. When the child stirred again, Samuel panicked for a moment. He hadn't held a baby since before everything had fallen apart. But instinct took over. He cradled the boy, found some leftover milk, warmed it, and fed him slowly, testing the temperature against his wrist, like his wife once taught him. The baby drank, tiny hands curling around Samuel's finger. And something in that simple contact, the warmth, the trust, cracked open a door inside his chest that he thought had sealed long ago. The night came quickly, as it always did in that part of the valley. Samuel lit a small oil lamp, sat beside the sleeping man and child, and listened. The man's breathing was uneven but steady. The baby slept with the unshakable peace of innocence. Samuel stayed awake for hours, his head nodding now and then, his heart strangely restless. He didn't know who these strangers were or where they had come from, but for the first time in years, his house did not feel empty. When dawn crept in through the cracks in the wall, the man stirred. His eyelids fluttered open. He tried to sit up, groaned in pain, and looked around, confusion clouding his face. Samuel stepped closer. "You're safe," he said simply. The man's voice came out a rasp. "Where am I?" "In my home. You fainted on the road." The stranger looked at him, eyes still foggy. Then his gaze fell on the basket, on the baby sleeping there. His shoulders sagged in relief, a sound escaping him that was halfway between a sigh and a prayer. "Your son?" Samuel asked gently. The man nodded, too weak for words. Samuel poured him some leaf tea and waited while the man sipped, hands trembling. They didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. Some silences carry more understanding than any conversation ever could. As the days passed, Samuel nursed them both. He cleaned wounds, boiled porridge, washed cloths. He did it without thinking of reward, without knowing their names. Yet each act felt like mending something invisible, not only in them, but in himself. On the third morning, the stranger finally spoke with more strength. His name was Kaibu. He was a mason, a builder of walls and homes. He had walked for days after losing everything. His wife had died giving birth to the child, Tumo. Her parents had turned him away, saying he brought misfortune. He'd tried to find work elsewhere, but grief doesn't pay wages. Hunger had followed him like a shadow, until his body gave out. Samuel listened without interrupting. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He simply nodded, the way men who've known loss acknowledge it without ceremony. Kaibu's eyes were tired, but when they landed on his son, they softened. "He's all I have left," he said quietly. Samuel looked at the sleeping boy and replied, "Then he's everything." Time in the village moved slowly. Word spread that the widower was hosting a strange man with a baby. People whispered, as they always do. Some said Samuel had gone mad, others that he was hiding fugitives. Samuel heard them, but he didn't care. He had stopped living for approval long ago. Days turned into weeks. Kaibu grew stronger. He began helping around the house, fixing the broken door, repairing the roof, chopping wood. The silence between the two men became a kind of language, gratitude without need for explanation. Tumo, the baby, grew brighter by the day. His laughter filled corners of the house that hadn't known sound in years. Samuel often found himself smiling at it, shyly, almost unwillingly, like someone remembering a song from long ago. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Samuel sat outside watching Kaibu rock the child to sleep. The sight pulled at something deep in him. He had spent years convinced that love only belonged to the past, that warmth had no place in his life anymore. Yet here it was again, soft and steady, uninvited but welcome. He looked at the sky and murmured, maybe it's not too late. That night, after putting Tumo to bed, Kaibu sat across from Samuel by the fire. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Kaibu said quietly, "You didn't have to help us." Samuel shrugged. "I know." "Why did you?" Samuel's eyes met his. The firelight flickered across the lines on his face, lines carved by years of silence, of endurance. "Because once, no one stopped for me. I guess I couldn't do the same." Kaibu didn't reply, but his eyes glistened in the dim light. He reached across the table, his calloused hand briefly resting on Samuel's. It was a gesture without pretense, without shame. Two men bound by loss, by chance, by something larger than either could name. Outside, the night whispered against the thatched roof. Inside, for the first time in a very long while, warmth filled the air. Not just from the fire, but from the quiet understanding that sometimes salvation comes not through miracles, but through simple acts of kindness. And though Samuel didn't yet know it, that single decision, stopping on a dusty road for a man and his child, was the moment his life began again. The morning after Kaibu could finally walk on his own, the village began to talk. Not with questions, not with concern, with whispers. In a place where everyone knew everyone's story or thought they did, a man's silence was more suspicious than a confession. And Samuel's house, once the symbol of loneliness, had become the most talked-about corner of the village. He heard them first at the well. Two men drawing water paused mid-conversation when he arrived. Their eyes flicked his way, their voices softened to that poisonous tone reserved for gossip disguised as curiosity. "You've seen him? The widower? Hosting that stranger and the child?" "I did. And they say he doesn't even know who they are." Strange times. A man living alone with another man and a baby that's not his. Maybe he's lost his mind." Samuel said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than defense. He filled his jug, nodded politely, and walked away. But the words stuck like dust to his back. At home, Kaibu was mending the broken stool. Tumo sat beside him, tapping a wooden spoon on the ground in rhythm with his father's hammer. The sight made Samuel smile, though he tried not to show it. "Seems he's learning fast," Samuel said, setting the jug down. Kaibu grinned, a rare thing for him. He learns what he sees. Samuel chuckled softly. "Then we'd better make sure we show him the right things." For a moment, they simply existed. Two men, one child, and a silence that felt whole instead of hollow. But beyond those clay walls, the air thickened with judgment. By the second week, everyone had an opinion. Some said Samuel had taken pity on a lost traveler. Others claimed Kaibu was a runaway criminal. A few swore the baby wasn't his at all, that he'd stolen it from a woman in another village. No one asked Samuel directly. They didn't need to. In small places, truth is whatever most people whisper. He heard it again at the market. A merchant he'd known for years refused to meet his eye. Another shortchanged him for firewood. And when he passed the baker's stall, two women turned their backs mid-conversation, their laughter sharp and empty. It stung, not because he hadn't faced cruelty before, but because he thought, foolishly, that kindness would be enough to silence cruelty. It wasn't. That evening he returned home heavier than when he'd left. Kaibu noticed immediately. "They're talking, aren't they?" Samuel didn't answer. He just sat by the fire, rubbing his palms together as if the friction could erase the noise. Kaibu sighed. I can go if it causes trouble. Samuel looked up sharply. No, you won't. You don't owe us this. And you don't owe me your disappearance, Samuel said, his tone firm. Let them talk. They've always talked. If not you, they'd find something else. Kaibu fell silent, watching the flames dance in the hearth. I don't want Tumo to grow up hearing lies about where he was welcomed. Samuel's gaze softened. He'll hear them, yes, but he'll also hear truth. And truth lasts longer. Outside, the wind began to stir the dry leaves, a sound like whispers carried by the night. Inside, the two men sat in the same silence that had once haunted Samuel, but now it was different. It wasn't emptiness. It was endurance. Weeks passed. Kaibu worked tirelessly, repairing fences, planting cassava, patching holes in Samuel's roof. The villagers watched, uncertain. They weren't ready to believe, but neither could they ignore. The house that had once looked abandoned now breathed with life. Smoke rose early each morning, the smell of porridge and boiled leaves drifting through the air. Children playing nearby began to wander closer, curious. One day, a little boy peeked through the fence and saw Tumo toddling around, chasing a chicken with more joy than coordination. Who's that? The boy asked. Samuel smiled. That's Tumo. He's my... He paused, unsure of the word. My little guest. The boy laughed. He laughs like my baby sister. Samuel nodded. Yes, he laughs like hope. The next morning, that same boy returned. This time with two others. They brought a small fruit basket. Mama said to give this to you, one said shyly. For the baby. Samuel's throat tightened. He took it, thanked them, and when they left, he stood for a long moment staring at the door, unsure whether to feel relief or gratitude. Perhaps, he thought, kindness spreads slower than gossip. But it does spread. Then came the storm. It started with low thunder at dusk, the kind that rolls across the hills before the rain ever comes. Samuel had gone out to secure the firewood when he noticed the sky, thick and bruised with clouds. We'll have a bad one tonight, he muttered. By the time he shut the door, rain was already pounding on the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks like a living thing. Tumo woke, crying. Kaibu tried to soothe him, pacing, humming something soft but trembling. The boy's forehead was hot, too hot. Samuel touched it, his stomach tightening. He's burning up. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that broke inside the house. Kaibu tried everything. Cool water, herbal compresses, songs. Nothing worked. Tumo's cries grew weaker, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Samuel knelt beside him, his voice breaking into a prayer he didn't know he remembered. Not him, Lord. Not this one. You've taken enough. If someone must pay, take my years, not his. Kaibu's tears mixed with the rain dripping through the roof. He can't die, he whispered, shaking. He can't. Hours passed. Thunder cracked. Lightning flashed through the room, revealing their faces. Desperation carved deep into every line. And then, as dawn neared, something shifted. The fever broke. The baby's breathing steadied. His cries turned to soft murmurs. Samuel exhaled the air he'd been holding all night and sank to the floor. Kaibu clutched his son, sobbing quietly, not from grief this time, but from a relief too large for words. When the sun rose, the world outside looked scrubbed clean, as if even the sky had been crying. Tumo slept peacefully in the basket, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. Neither man spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Some moments are prayers already answered. Word of the storm and the miracle child spread quickly. But for once, the gossip carried a different tone. Less poison, more awe. Some said the widower's prayer had reached heaven. Others believed Kaibu had brought luck to the house. Whatever the reason, the village's voices softened. And as they softened, something else grew. Respect. Quiet, tentative, but real. One morning, Samuel went to the well again. The same men who'd whispered weeks ago greeted him first this time. "Good morning, Samuel." He nodded, surprised. "You still hosting that Mason?" "Yes." "Well," one said, scratching his head, "seems he fixed your roof better than the ones in the chief's house." The other laughed. "Maybe he should fix the bridge next. That thing's falling apart." They laughed lightly, not mockery this time, but the first hint of acceptance. Samuel walked home that day with a small, unfamiliar feeling sitting warm in his chest. Maybe it was pride, maybe peace. He couldn't tell. At the gate, Kaibu was splitting wood, sweat running down his neck, the rhythmic thud of the axe steady as a heartbeat. Samuel watched him for a moment before saying, "You heard what they said?" Kaibu looked up, brow raised. "What now?" "They think you should fix the bridge." Kaibu smiled faintly. "Then maybe I will." And just like that, the seed was planted. The bridge that would one day connect not just two sides of the river, but the broken pieces of their lives. That night, as Samuel sat watching the firelight flicker against the clay walls, he realized something. All his life, he had carried firewood to survive, but the fire that burned in his home now, the warmth that came from care, from shared silence, from simple human connection, that was something different. That was living. And though he didn't know what the days ahead would bring for the first time since burying his wife, Samuel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to walk alone forever. Morning came washed clean after the storm. The air smelled of wet clay and smoke, and the village felt strangely quiet, as if it too were catching its breath. Samuel stepped outside with a bucket of water balanced in one hand. The yard was a tangle of broken branches, soaked leaves, and the faint steam that rises when the sun finds the last of the rain. Inside, Kaibu and little Tumo were sleeping side by side. The child's tiny hand rested on his father's chest, the rhythm of their breathing finally in sync. Samuel paused at the doorway, watching them. The sight made something loosen in his chest. Not quite joy, not quite sadness, but the tender ache that comes from remembering what love once felt like. For the first time in years, Samuel hummed while he worked. A small sound, low and rough from disuse, but music all the same. He mended the fence, cleared the yard, let the morning soak through his skin like grace. Each task felt lighter than it should have, as if gratitude had found a way to weave itself into the motion of his hands. Kaibu woke around noon. He moved slower than usual, but there was color in his face again, and when he saw Samuel sweeping the last of the storm's debris, he smiled. "We survived," he said simply. Samuel leaned on the broom. "We did more than that. We lived." They ate quietly, thin porridge, sweetened with a handful of roasted corn. When Tumo woke, his eyes were bright, curious again, like he'd already forgotten the fever. Children, Samuel thought, heal the way light slips back through clouds, quietly but completely. The days that followed passed with a calm so gentle it felt like the world was apologizing. Kaibu worked on small things, fixing hinges, rebuilding the chicken coop, strengthening the fence. Each hammer blow echoed through the village like a heartbeat, announcing that life was returning to the house everyone once pitied. But peace never stays unnoticed for long. One afternoon, while Samuel was at the market, he heard his name whispered again. Not cruelly this time, but curiously. The villagers had seen Kaibu repairing the collapsed footbridge by the river. Without being asked, he'd begun gathering men to help, cutting planks, tying ropes, sketching rough plans in the dirt. The same people who once mocked Samuel now hovered nearby, pretending to pass through, but really just watching. When Samuel returned, he found Kaibu covered in sawdust, sweat streaking his temples, Tumo tied to his back in a strip of cloth. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked. Kaibu didn't stop working. "They said the bridge was broken. Thought maybe I could fix it." Samuel chuckled. "You're trying to fix more than wood." Kaibu glanced up, smiling. "Maybe wood's just easier to start with." By the third day, half the village was helping. Men brought tools, boys fetched water, women cooked meals for the workers. The rhythm of hammers and saws replaced the rhythm of gossip. In place of suspicion, something older and truer took root: cooperation. At dusk, Samuel watched from the riverbank. The bridge rose little by little, not just out of timber, but out of trust. He hadn't seen such unity since before Lena died. Watching Kaibu move among them, quiet, capable, teaching by doing, he realized the younger man was building more than a crossing. He was rebuilding faith itself. That night, by the fire, Samuel said softly, "You know, they'll remember this." Kaibu looked puzzled. "Remember what?" "This. That one man's hands were enough to make the rest remember theirs." Kaibu stared into the flames for a while before answering. "Then let them remember yours too. You carried us here." Samuel shook his head. "I only opened the door. You walked through it." The next morning, the chief came, a tall man with slow steps and eyes that weighed everything. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched Kaibu work. After a while, he said, "We could use a mason like you if you choose to stay." Kaibu hesitated. "Stay?" The chief nodded. "A man who can build bridges should never walk without a home." Samuel felt the words like sunlight on cold skin. For months, he'd been bracing himself for Kaibu to leave once he recovered, because everyone leaves eventually. But now, the idea of him staying felt almost too much to hope for. Kaibu didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Samuel, at Tumo chasing chickens in the yard, at the clay walls that had sheltered them. And though his lips stayed silent, his eyes said everything. The following days unfolded like pages of a calmer book. The bridge was finished, sturdy, beautiful in its simplicity. The villagers held a small feast. They sang, they clapped, they told stories. And when the chief raised a gourd of palm wine to toast the man who had led them, Kaibu spoke only one sentence: "I already found my home." He pointed toward Samuel's house. The murmurs that followed were not of disbelief, but of respect. The gossip that once cut like knives had turned into quiet admiration. After the feast, when the last torches had burned low, Samuel sat outside watching the river reflect the moonlight off the new bridge. Kaibu joined him, setting Tumo on his lap. They didn't talk for a while. They just listened, to crickets, to water, to peace. Then Kaibu said, "Do you ever think about her?" Samuel didn't need to ask who. "Every day, but it doesn't hurt the same way anymore." Kaibu nodded. "My wife's name was Nandila. When she died, I thought the world ended. I couldn't see that life was still waiting somewhere." He looked at Tumo. "Now I see it every morning." Samuel smiled faintly. "Loss never leaves. It just learns to sit quietly beside us." Kaibu's eyes glistened in the firelight. Maybe mercy is when someone sits beside you, too. For a long moment, they sat there, two men bound by grief, by rebuilding, by the small miracle of being seen. The night was cool, the stars steady, and in that stillness, Samuel realized that what had begun as pity had become kinship, not born of blood, but of shared endurance. The next weeks were simple and full. They worked the garden together, taught Tumo to walk without falling, rebuilt part of the roof. When the rains threatened again, Samuel no longer feared them. The house was stronger now, and so were the hearts inside it. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with ash and gold, Samuel brewed tea. He poured 2 cups, handed one to Kaibu, and said quietly, "You know, the firewood I dropped that day, I used to think it was all I had left of purpose." Kaibu looked at him. "And now?" Samuel smiled. "Now I think it was just making space for something worth carrying." They sat in silence after that, the kind that comes only when no more words are needed. The lamps flickered. Tumo laughed in his sleep. Outside, the wind whispered through the cashew leaves, soft, content, almost grateful. The widower who once walked alone through dust and memory had found warmth again, not through miracle or romance, but through the steady fire of mercy, the mercy of choosing to care when the world says turn away. And so the house that once held only silence now breathed with laughter. The man who once prayed for death now thanked the heavens for dawn. And in the small glow of that clay home, 3 lives, one broken, one rebuilding, one just beginning, burned quietly, together, like coals that never fade. The new bridge changed everything. At first it was only wood and rope, a way for the villagers to reach the market without wading through the river. But in time, people began to cross it for reasons that had nothing to do with trade, to share food, to visit, to talk. It became a meeting place, a passage not just over water but over old grudges. Samuel noticed it most in the sound of mornings. The village used to wake with roosters and arguments. Now he woke to laughter on the path outside his home, to the rhythm of feet passing by, men, women, children, carrying baskets, carrying stories. The house that had once been avoided had become a stop for greetings, a place to rest, to share news, to borrow tools. He never asked for any of it. It had simply happened, like light slowly creeping through cracks. Kaibu worked each day with his quiet precision. He repaired roofs, taught the young men how to lay proper brick, showed the boys how to build small wooden stools instead of wasting their hands on idle games. The village began to thrive, and though his name was often praised, he always nodded toward Samuel's home and said, "It started there." Samuel never grew comfortable with the attention. He preferred listening, fixing, offering tea. But even he couldn't deny the warmth that had returned to his days. The same people who once whispered behind his back now came to ask his opinion on crops, to bring him fruit, to tell him how strong little Tumo was growing. He had lived long enough to know that love doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from the simple courage to open a door. The seasons rolled forward. The rainy months ended. The fields turned golden, and the smell of harvest filled the air. The bridge still stood strong, and so did the friendship between the 2 men. They shared work, laughter, and silence with the same ease. But one evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Samuel noticed Kaibu sitting alone by the river, his shoulders tense, his gaze distant. The air around him carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. Samuel joined him, lowering himself slowly onto the rock beside him. "You look like a man counting the horizon," he said. Kaibu smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." "Thinking of leaving?" Kaibu's silence was answer enough. Samuel took a slow breath. "You don't owe anyone your staying, but I hope you know this place. This home doesn't ask for repayment. It only asks for presence." Kaibu rubbed the blue beads around his neck, the ones he had worn since the day Samuel found him. "When you've spent your life walking, sometimes staying still feels heavier than the road." "Then stay because it's heavy," Samuel said. "That's how roots grow." Kaibu looked at him, eyes glimmering in the last light. "You speak like someone who's learned it the hard way." "I have," Samuel answered quietly. "The earth doesn't hold a seed because it's easy. It holds it because it's meant to." They sat there until the moon climbed over the trees. The river moved like a silver vein through the dark, and the bridge cast a long, patient shadow over the water, a reminder that what's built with care endures. Days passed, and Kaibu didn't leave. He didn't announce it. He simply went on mending fences and mixing mortar as if the question had never been asked. Samuel said nothing either. Some understandings don't need confirmation. The village kept changing. It grew louder, kinder. New homes were built with the same sturdy design Kaibu had taught them. And whenever the villagers gathered, they would look toward Samuel's home, the first place where compassion had been given without asking anything back. And remember how it all began. Years slipped forward quietly, the way years always do when life is full. He could already patch cracks, polish wood, and tell when the soil was ready for planting. But what he learned most was patience, from Samuel, who spoke little but saw everything. The neighbor who once refused to help, the man who had later come to share bread, the child who once feared him but now played in his yard. "Do people always change?" the boy once asked. Samuel smiled. "Not always, but sometimes one act of mercy can make them want to." "Like when you helped father?" Samuel's voice softened. "No, Tumo. Like when your father helped me back." One afternoon, while Kaibu was rebuilding the wall near the school, the chief approached Samuel with an idea. "We've been talking," he said. "This village needs a meeting hall, a place for everyone to gather when the rains come or when decisions must be made." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And you want Kaibu to build it?" "Of course," the chief smiled. "But we want you to bless the first brick." Samuel almost laughed. "Bless it? I'm no priest." "Maybe not," said the chief. "But mercy is its own blessing. You began this." So the following week, under a sky clear as glass, the whole village gathered. Kaibu placed the first brick on the foundation, his hand steady. Samuel stepped forward, rested his palm on the cool clay, and whispered something no one else could hear. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a thank you. When the hall was finished, it wasn't grand, just strong, welcoming, open to all. And in its center, near the doorway, the villagers placed a small carving of 3 figures, an old man, a younger man, and a child. No one needed to explain who they were. Time went on. The bridge weathered storms, the fields changed colors, and the laughter of new children echoed through the valley. Samuel's hair turned completely white. His hands grew slower, but his eyes never lost their light. On a late evening, sitting by the doorway, he watched Tumo chase fireflies while Kaibu patched a fence. The scene glowed golden in the sunset. Samuel thought of Lena, of how grief had once been the only thing that kept him company, and realized that it had quietly been replaced by gratitude. Life hadn't given him back what it took, but it had given him something different, something steady. Kaibu looked up from his work and said, "The boy's fast." Samuel smiled. "He'll outrun both of us soon." "Maybe he already has," Kaibu replied. They laughed together, soft, easy laughter that came from a place healed by years. That night, after Tumo fell asleep, Samuel sat awake longer than usual. The moon poured through the window, silvering the floor. He felt the weight of time on his shoulders, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, like a blanket. He whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." Outside, the wind carried the scent of cassava and distant rain. Somewhere across the river, an owl called once, then again, and silence returned. Not the empty kind, but the kind that holds everything. When dawn came, the village awoke to the same peace it had fought for years to find. Samuel sat on his porch, tea steaming in his hands, watching Kaibu and Tumo walk toward the bridge with tools slung across their shoulders. They looked back once, waving. He waved in return, a smile tugging at his lips. The widower, who had once been invisible, was invisible no more. He had become part of the very soil, part of every home, every laugh that crossed that bridge. And if you asked the villagers years later who taught them that kindness is stronger than judgment, they would point toward that small clay house by the road, the one where mercy had taken root. Because mercy, once lit, never truly dies. It burns quietly, like a fire inside old wood, steady, patient, and warm enough to light the way for anyone willing to begin again.